All right. Good morning. Welcome to our Halloween edition of Coffee Talk. My name's Sean O'Brien, President of Quick Rate. And as always, I'm pleased to be joined by Steve Huntington. Steve, go ahead and introduce yourself.
Yeah, thanks everyone for joining us today to our special edition of Coffee Talk. I'm Steve Huntington, Director of Analytics here at Quick Analytics. Spent my entire career working with community financial institutions from all over the country in all manners of analysis and strategic planning, and spent more than half my career working here for Sean at Quick Rate. And as you can see, he's been working me to the bone.
Well played. We are pleased to welcome back our dear friend Paul Allen from Saltmarsh. Welcome, Paul. Thanks for joining us. You want to go ahead and introduce yourself?
Good morning, Sean. Good morning, Steve. Don't have a mask. Sorry.
Too hot in there.
Yeah. I guess I have my old guy mask on. So, my name's Paul Allen. I'm with Saltmarsh, Cleveland and Gunn, and we have the great honor to work with financial institutions all over the country, and enjoy working with both of you on helping folks get through CECL.
Awesome. Well, thanks again for joining us, Paul. We'll talk a little bit more about Saltmarsh there at the end, but just a slide of all the services and office locations that they have. Just a reminder, all of you are muted when you join, so certainly go ahead and use the chat box or the Q&A feature for questions. We will take those as they come in, hopefully in the midst of the discussion at an appropriate break. Or certainly towards the end of the presentation, but one way or another, we'll acknowledge and respond to all of the items in the Q&A box in the chat feature. Just a reminder, again, hopefully CECL, these coffee talks have helped all of you kind of work your way through the process. I think we, are, as Paul's going to touch on, have kind of moved from implementation on, from the initial implementation now, and now we're kind of best practicing and validation. So we'll touch on that. But as always, a couple things. We will send a link to the recording today along with a copy of the slides. So look for that probably on Monday afternoon. But we will record all those. And as we've done throughout the year, we'll start with some polling questions, and these will be part of that email as well. So 5 questions today. Certainly, ask for your participation. So we'll get started on these. The first one being really as we think about going into 2025, that there's areas where you'd like greater support in your CECL process. We'd love to know them. I think we've updated the polling feature to allow for you to type in your answers. So if you have any areas where you'd like us to provide greater support or focus a coffee talk on for next year, we certainly would welcome that, and thought this would be one way to kind of start that conversation. So anything, if you want, we'll just give it a few seconds here for all of you to put something in there, and then we'll move on to the other polling questions. All right, so we'll stop this one. Thank you for submitting those. We'll go on to the next polling question just regarding the ACL. A lot of familiar questions today. Has your allowance for credit losses increased, decreased, or stayed the same this year? So we'll just give this about 30 seconds. Okay, perfect. Thank you. We'll share these. So 48% of you have seen an increase, 42% have stayed the same, and 9% have decreased the allowance. So thank you for participating. The next one is regarding Q factors, kind of the same question. Have your Q factors increased, decreased, or stayed the same this year? Just a single choice again. We'll give it about 30 seconds. Okay, thank you again. Share these results. 69% of you have, your Q factors have stayed the same, 28% have seen an increase, and 3% have seen a decrease. Thank you. The next question up is around past due loans. Again, same format. Are you seeing any increase in past due loans? Yes, no, about the same. Share these. 54% of you have seen an increase, 31% about the same, and 15% have not seen any increase. So thank you for participating. And I believe our final question is around the unfunded commitments. Do you currently have an amount reserved for unfunded commitments? Yes or no? And this one, 63% of you do, and 38% for rounding do not. So again, thank you all for participating in those polling questions. We will include these in the email on Monday. So let's get started. So as I mentioned, we're thrilled to have Paul rejoin us. We always value his perspective. So we'll start today just some topics that have been that Paul has been on his mind and just thought would be helpful here today, particularly as we move from implementation to maintenance. Paul, I think you might be muted, but I think you're ready to go. There we go.
Yeah, Sean, it's been interesting. First of all, congratulations for everyone. Excuse me. To everyone for getting through it, CECL, right? We've all been working really hard on getting through the process and so forth. And so we're kind of starting to shift from implementation. Everybody understands CECL. We put it out there. Our regulators and our auditors are starting to understand it. So now, just like any other process within the institution, we're starting to think about, what about maintenance? How do I, on a go-forward basis, make this a routine and normative process for us? And then I wanted to share some thoughts on credit risk, and especially for those institutions that are within areas that were affected by recent weather-related events, the storm impacts and so forth. So I just wanted to point out, we use models throughout the institutions, right? Throughout the industry, we use different models. And so we're focused on one model, CECL, but we have ongoing models that we use. And so when we shift into ongoing maintenance, one of the questions, or three of the questions, I should say, that you probably want to focus on is, what is your institution going to do about model validation? Are you going to do it on a periodic basis, which is what the regulatory guidance suggests? How frequently? Who will do that? Is that discussed, and so forth? And so our first model validation is really to test to see this big thing that we put in place, is it working? But on an ongoing basis, we would normally expect to do that periodically. And so I think there's going to be regulators and external auditors that are going to walk in and say, hey, how are you? What are you doing about this? So I would encourage you to have discussions within the management team, within the audit or supervisory or board level. What are we going to do about this on an ongoing basis? We often get questions about whether you have to do it every year. Not necessarily. Just like anything else, we do a risk assessment and we determine what's the risk related to this area. And so how frequently do we have to test the internal controls and process and procedures? And I'm kind of expecting that for most credit unions, that would be something that you do. Once you've done it the first time, perhaps every 2 or 3 years, or any time there's a major change in the model or the process around the modeling. Secondly, I'll bet all of you lost some sleep and sweated a little bit and had a whole bunch of folks working on how do we map our loan trial balance and our general ledger into the model, garbage in, garbage out. How do we make sure that all of that information is getting into the model correctly? So we spent a lot of time on mapping, but on an ongoing basis, we change our features, we add new loan products, we change the features of the products and so forth. And so in a maintenance mode, you would have to occasionally recheck the mapping. And so I encourage you to think about what would be your process. Would you select every year 5% of the data and try to map it? Would you do that? How would you do that? Where you check and make sure that when things change, you're making sure that the data going into the model is mapped correctly. And then finally, Steve is always going to be working on this, enhancing the model and so forth. But, how do we actually change the economic factors as we go through maintenance? We've kind of spent a lot of time scratching our head and agonizing about what economic factors we should use at the implementation. But as you know, there's lots and lots of uncertainty right now where everyone's kind of expecting economic data to be changing. We have a big election. We have a lot of uncertainty in economic factors and so forth. So who's going to be responsible for changing those? How often are you going to be revisiting those? Certainly, I think regulators kind of expect that you're looking at that or considering whether changes are appropriate every quarter. But at this point, I would encourage you to perhaps, write a procedure. Maybe it's a half page or a page. How are we going to consider economic factors? Who are we going to do? How are we going to do that process? And how is it documented? So those are the three things that we'll have to kind of keep in mind. And Sean, I remember when we went through the liquidity crisis in 2023, everyone kind of knew who their big customers were, and everybody kind of knew we had some uninsured deposits. All of a sudden, folks were walking into the institution and saying, show me the report. And so at this point, I think there's going to be an expectation that when folks ask you, what's your ongoing process for maintaining the CECL model that you've spent so much time and resources, they're going to expect you to not go, hadn't thought about that. I think there's an expectation that we have policies, procedures, and honestly, documentation and minutes with audit, supervisory board meetings and so forth. So that's really what I encourage folks to be thinking about is are you ready to shift from implementation into maintenance and get ahead of those issues?
Absolutely, Paul. Yeah, go ahead.
So I did want to talk a little bit about credit risk, just because, my goodness gracious, that sure seems to be what on everybody's mind right now. Sean, this has been the great dilemma of when the elephant will sit down.
Yeah.
The last couple of years, we've talked about is, boy, it's been great. Low charge-offs, hardly any problems. When's it going to turn? And we're just not yet seeing a lot of problems, although recently we are seeing a little bit of increase in consumer delinquencies, and we're seeing a little bit of issues in some of the business lending, particularly in office and retail and hotel and multifamily. So there's been an expectation, and so again, I encourage you not to wait and get surprised, but to start having those conversations kind of ahead of time about what will we do and so forth. And then if you'll go to the next slide, Sean, just wanted to kind of give a quick update on that, because what we've been talking about are these areas, particularly in folks working remotely. What's that going to do to office space? People are dealing with economic stress. How about urban areas in hotel and so forth? But one of the things that we sort of can update that with is that we're historically in a very unusual period of time with an inverted yield curve. And that's always, and every regulator walks in and says, that the inverted yield curve predicts a recession. And we can say, well, we're not there yet, but we need to talk about that a little bit. We need to look at what the Federal Reserve actions do to different customers, especially customers that perhaps had a relatively low interest rate, and that may get priced up. What will that do to their cash flows and so forth? And so there's this expectation that while we don't know when the elephant will sit down, there's certainly an expectation that institutions should be thinking about that and so forth. And then finally, for those of you that are in areas that have gone through weather-related events, certainly the appropriate focus it has been on our customers and our employees, making sure they're alive, that they have shelter, that they have food, that they have what they need. But obviously, the country has endured some economic impact, and there's going to be unknowns that have to be resolved about who pays for the collateral. What's the collateral worth? Can you find the collateral? What does it do to the cash flows of small businesses and consumers and so forth? And so, all of those things are uncertainties that we can't put our fingers around, but I would certainly encourage management teams to be thinking about that a little bit. And so, that next slide kind of begs the question. So what do we do about that in the approach? And Sean, on that next slide, I tried to put just a few thoughts perhaps to take away. And that is, I think there's an expectation that we should be thinking about the potential. In other words, are you in for example, a storm impacted area? Have you taken an inventory of which customers are likely to be impacted at that? Certainly not expecting anyone to increase their reserves right now or write off any loans or anything, but do you have a report? Do you know what that is? Secondly, if you are doing business loans, what's your geographic market? Are you in urban areas? Have you thought about looking at certain of the loans with the trends toward remote work or otherwise? And then have you looked at perhaps draw a line, all loans over this dollar amount? When will they reprice, and are they likely to reprice in a way that adversely impacts the borrower? And if so, does it mean that you reserve more for them necessarily? But at this point, it would be helpful to know where are those. And then, just a couple of those other points, like the last one, everyone is going through a lot of turnover in staff. And so one of the factors that we have in our qualitative is looking at, has there been a significant change in our loan or underwriting staff or procedures or underwriting approach? And would that be a qualitative factor that would perhaps adjust my historical loss? Because my historical loss was based on this staffing. What if I've changed the staffing? What if I don't have the same people with the same competence in there and so forth? So just some things to think about. And then, boy, I hate to meddle, Sean, but that last slide, just thought I'd give you some takeaways. Just to maybe consider on the next slide there, if you shift to that next slide, here's 3 things you might want to think about. You might want to think about picking some larger loans and going through the process of perhaps re-underwriting. What do we know about the collateral value today? And what do you know about what the loan yield or loan rate would be as that loan reprices? And if so, does that inform you about that loan? And certainly very difficult to, Sean, it'd be impossible to do that for every loan, but certainly to isolate the loans and have some response when a regulator walks in and says, have you thought anything about collateral values or repricing? You say, yeah. And I know a lot of institutions will say, well, the loan's current and it's got a low LTV. I don't need to think about anything else. But we're seeing that regulators want to say, yeah, that may be true, but I still want to talk about cash flows. Have you looked at cash flows from those? So I would encourage you to be thinking about that. It doesn't take that long to do that analysis on your portfolio, but I would encourage you to get ahead of it. And that second point is sort of the same thing. If you are in an area that was impacted by recent weather events, the storm damage, and so forth, it's going to take months for us to clean that stuff up. You know, Sean, you and I have talked about the fact that, you know, Katrina worked out pretty well over time, but it took months for FEMA money and other things to come in. So there's a lot unknown, but you can figure out how many of my borrowers are likely impacted. They may be fine, but what are they likely? So having that report once again just answers that immediate question. Have you thought about it? Yes, I have. And then for maintenance, encourage the management teams to also just look through and say, however we're doing our CECL process in terms of from soup to nuts, you know, thinking about it, the model we use, what we do with that, have we actually taken the time to write that down and set procedures and determine what is my normal process going to be on a go forward basis? And then talking with the audit or supervisory committee and the board and having that documented. Again, those three things, Sean, you don't have to do it. I'm not saying there's a regulatory requirement, but I think there will be a regulatory expectation that management teams have kind of thought ahead. And just like when we had the liquidity,
yeah,
you want to have that lit. Here's my large balance customers, and here's my uninsured deposits. I haven't done anything about it. I haven't turned any of those people away, but at least I know what it is I'm dealing with in the risk profile of my institution. I hope that's not too much meddling or too high an expectation, but I think that's probably where you might want to be moving toward.
I would agree, Paul. Right. I think again, ultimately, you know, having good data around your customers is invaluable. And again, whether you accomplish that through reporting, through communication, and communicating that to the board on the deposit side and the loan side, you know, informs you know, few factors. It informs risk, you know, direction. And so again, having access to that information about your own loan base is invaluable, and I think will be increasingly invaluable as we move forward. Well, that's perfect, Paul. Appreciate that insights. Again, if you have any questions on any of that information, certainly submit a question in the chat or the Q&A. As we move forward, you know, we've talked a lot and continue to just try to be mindful of updating you about any updates or enhancements that are being done to the tool. You'll notice at the bottom, we've talked a few of these the last previous coffee talk, but again, just kind of want to keep a running total of these for you. Always reminding you that none of these impact the calculation directly. They are here typically solely is either it is an administrative improvement, more information around context, just to trying to provide additional support and flexibility. So again, none of these impact the calculation directly, and just always want to emphasize that these are always optional for you. But to that end, I think one enhancement that we made and touched on briefly last month was just the incorporation of video tools or reminders of different areas throughout the tool that again address, you know, what's going on a particular page, or something that's been a common question about a particular page, or tab. So Steve, I'll let you jump in here and talk about some of the Loom videos that you've edited for our users.
Sure. Thanks, Sean. So the majority of these Loom videos are where we found a particular topic that's had of great importance or a large amount of interest from our users, from our coffee talks, and sort of clipped out a shorter segment that just discusses that topic. And then we place those throughout the tool, kind of where they would come up and be of relevance in your CECL calculations. You can also click on the header there where it says helpful hints, and that'll provide a pop-up that'll show all the video links that we have. And that's the list right now. This is obviously going to be an evolving list when we discuss a topic over again that has kind of a fresh perspective. We may add that as an additional or replace an older one with a newer one. If there's any particular topics that you remember from an old coffee talk or something that we haven't addressed that you'd like to discuss or see a video on, or something that comes up in an audit or an exam that you'd like some more clarification on, please. We'd love to hear your input and feedback on topics to add to this, or things you might have remembered from the past that we can dig out and put in a video for you guys. Yeah, and this is another thing we added, I believe, just last month. We just wanted to give, once a year, the Federal Reserve comes out with very large paper, which is focused on providing data and assumptions for those annual stress tests that the larger DFAST institutions around the country have to still provide. And while reading through all of that can be largely unhelpful for a typical credit union, we thought that the data that they provide for the stress testing scenarios, the economic data, was very helpful, because it's a handful of economic trends that we not only have a large amount of consistent history with, going back quarterly over 20 years, but also on an apples to apples basis have forward-looking projections from lots of economists going on a quarterly basis, going up forward 3 years for each of these different economic line items. So I thought it'd be great that we could provide this to you guys, not only in coming up with, but also justifying qualitative factor adjustments depending upon the way you see some of these economic trends heading in the future, particularly in your neck of the woods. And so what we have is 3 separate tabs, or 3 separate buttons. The first one is just those trends going back in time on a quarterly basis. Like I said, for multiple economic cycles. Most of them are percentages like GDP growth, unemployment rates, inflation, mortgage and prime rates, etc. But a handful of them are also just index values, like housing prices, volatility, etc. But this is the exact list that the Fed uses in those stress testing requirements for larger institutions. The baseline scenario, those are true economic projections. So they're kind of midline or median economic projections that the Fed uses from lots of economic sources. And then the severely adverse scenario is not an economic projection. It is simply a kind of a worst case or close to worst case hypothetical scenario from some of those same economists, just recognizing that the severely adverse are going to be obviously much more drastic numbers, but they are not in any way, shape, or form what we expect to happen. They're not projections, just an adverse hypothetical scenario. John.
Perfect. Thanks, Steve. Yeah, and again, I think this is here to just kind of give you some context around kind of what expectations are, but then, as Paul was touching on, right, some of this is, trying to identify vulnerable areas of our portfolio, thinking about what changes to economic conditions how it might impact our loan portfolio, and just maybe giving you some situational scenario analysis to consider, right? Stress testing is always a positive, proactive demonstration of risk management. And so again, trying to focus that on the most vulnerable pieces of your portfolio, again, is just a good risk management process that will then in turn likely inform your CECL's Q factors. So again, that's kind of the thinking here. You just want to try to keep improving the tool and the sources of information that we can provide you with. Again, Steve will jump in here on this, but we'll continue to update the user trends and make this more available. We'll touch on here in a second, but Steve, you want to touch again, or just add anything around the data that you're collecting and sharing?
Yeah, this information we're updating it on a quarterly basis. It comes from all of our CECLSolver users, of which there are many now. So it's a very robust data set coming from hundreds of institutions from all over the country at different asset sizes, running scenarios throughout the quarters. And it's already been updated on our site for third quarter, and it's a great way for you to see. None of this is publicly available information coming from call reports, getting to see what other users are calculating for warms. We know the NCUA has some guidance there as well on warm values, but it's the sample size that they use and the institutions that they have this data on is relatively limited, and it's not publicly available either. It's on a curated list of credit unions under $100 million in assets, and that's all that we publicly know. Whereas this, we probably have a broader data set and are able to look at those warms at the segment level for all of our users over time, and also qualitative factors as well. See what your peers are using for Q factor adjustments over time, and directionally. A lot of this is most helpful from a directional context, right? Your institution is going to be a little bit different. Everyone has a handles their portfolio and has a bit of a different looking portfolio in a different market. But seeing what direction warms are going in different segments, and seeing what direction qualitative factor adjustments are going, I think is where this can be the most helpful. And this data is available before call reports come out, right? On October, I believe, well, we shared the third quarter preliminary stuff on our last coffee talk, which was the last couple of days of September. Because this data is internal and we get it instantaneously, we can see what credit unions around the country have been doing to their warms throughout the quarter before the end of the quarter. And so they're can provide some leading indicators of the direction things are going, which can help you in your analysis, depending upon when you're filing and when you're doing your CECL analyses. Go ahead and we show not only medians, but also a range, right? 25th and 75th percentile. So it's not just about focusing on exactly what the midpoint is, but what direction the higher values and performers are going, and the lower ones as well. Next slide. Yeah, that's just some information about which we shared in the past. As of right now, the way you can get to this data is a little bit convoluted. You click on our knowledge base button, and that opens up a new tab with our CECL knowledge base, and then there's a link in there that takes you to all of this data. We wanted to make that information a lot more easy to find within the tool and readily available. And so on our next slide, you'll see something that's coming live next week. So as of next Monday, we've added a new tab to our tabs right there in the CECLSolver, the one called CECLSolver User Trends. So you no longer have to open up multiple new tabs to get to the knowledge base and then the link. You can see these internal trends right there all the way on the right. The public peer data, the peer data tab that we've always had on there, is now just the public peer data tab, and we've sort of reorganized the tabs a little bit just to make them, I think, a little bit more intuitive as far as the flow of the tool and how you use it. We have an overview tab, and then we have 4 tabs that are typically what you would use in regularly updating your scenario for the loan portfolio. And then the 2 green tabs are, unfunded commitments and the securities reserves, which are separate entities on the balance sheet and in the financials. And so we've kind of visually separated them here a little bit, just to try to keep everything flowing well and organized. John? Oh, yes. And this is something coming up. Just wanted to whet everyone's appetite a little bit for some enhanced peer loss analysis. So this is a screenshot from our sort of internal development. You'll see here these are commercial bank loan segments, not the credit union segments, because that's what I had in a way that we could provide a visual for today. But the idea was, in addition to our standard way of calculating peer loss rates historically over time, we wanted to give our users some more flexibility. So instead of just looking at some averages, they could say, well, I want to see at the fringe, what are the 75th percentile loss rates for my peers going way back in time for this segment or that segment. And so you have the ability to choose medians or 75th or 90th percentile loss rates going back in time for your peer group at the segment level. So you would just type in a different percentile there on the right for one segment or another, or at the bottom for the entire portfolio. You can bring up the percentile rank up or down, and it just provides an additional level of analysis if you're if you are trying to see how bad some of the worst institutions in your marketplace, performed during different times historically, and you think that's going to be helpful in justifying maybe a different qualitative factor adjustment than what the sort of the average values from your peers would show, or if you just want to kind of stress test your market or your peer group historically and see, at those higher stress, higher percentile loss rates, how bad did it really get during certain economic time environments in the past? You'll be able to do that directly here within the tool. This is modeling and technology that we have created in the past when building a portfolio level credit stress test for some of our other users. And it's something we wanted to share not only with CECL here in the short term, but the idea is maybe at some point further down the road, providing or offering a credit stress test to if we have interested credit unions for that sort of a potential product as well. So if that's something that interests you and you have an interest in as we potentially develop it moving forward, please reach out to us and we can talk about it. John?
Absolutely. And so again, I think this is just another example of trying to give you more context. Again, a lot of what we shared with you in the past is been around medians and weighted averages. This just gives you, again, as you think about how severe things could be, what have people experienced in the past, we think we'll just give you greater context as you think about your own loan portfolio. So again, doesn't impact the calculation, but just hopefully it gives you additional information by which you can have better context and support for any of the decisions you might be making around your Q factors. Okay, so certainly a lot to digest today. If you have any questions, go ahead and put those into the Q&A or the chat feature now. We'll take those. Again, as I mentioned at the top, Saltmarsh does validation. So not only are they a tremendous supporter and friend of ours here at Quick Rate, but they also can be a tremendous partner for you as well. So if you're looking for someone to do a validation, or if you're asked to do a validation, Paul and his team can certainly assist. They have familiarity with the CECLSolver, so we think they're the ideal partner on this. So their contact information is here. We certainly have, again, continued to chronicle all of our webinars and coffee talks on our YouTube channel. So there's a link to this. Certainly a reminder that we'll be back next month with our final installment of Coffee Talk for 2024. I can't actually believe I'm saying that out loud. I can't believe how fast the year has gone, but here we are nonetheless. So certainly encourage you to register. As I mentioned, you'll always get a link to the recording and a copy of the slides and the polling results. If you register, that will likely for this month come out on Monday afternoon or Tuesday morning. So we'll include all that as well. But I'm not seeing anything in the chat or in the Q&A. So appreciate everybody's time today. Paul and Steve, any final thoughts or comments before we let everybody off to their weekend?
I just want to give everybody a big pat on the back for getting through CECL. I know a lot of people probably learned more about CECL and modeling than they really wanted to know. But appreciate everyone's help, and I especially appreciate you and Steve in providing all the different tools. Encourage folks to look around the website a little bit and just look at the different tools available, because most of those tools will answer the questions that we routinely see regulators and external auditors ask about. So just want to thank everybody for putting up with this big project called CECL. So enjoyed the time with you today.
Thank you, Paul. Always a pleasure to have you on. Appreciate what you do for us. And so thanks again to Paul. Thanks to Steve. Thanks to all of you for joining us today. I hope you have a great weekend, and we will see you next month.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, everybody.